He was born into the imperial family of Rome. A youth of promise who inherited a great and prosperous empire. But he was torn by passion and corrupted by power. The emperor's name was Nero.
Let him kill me, only let him rule. Agrippina.
Early in the 1st century AD, the power of Rome stretched from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Persia. Romans had not suffered civil war for nearly 70 years. Since the reign of the first emperor, Augustus, they had accepted an hereditary ruler as the price of peace and stability. The empire prospered. At its heart stood the imperial dynasty, which had become prey to deadly intrigue and rivalry. It was into this family in AD 37 that Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the future emperor Nero, was born. Lucius's childhood was insecure. His father died when Lucius was only 4. His mother, Agrippina, was the sister of the eccentric emperor Caligula. Though an imperial princess, she had fallen from her brother's favor and had been sent into exile. But Agrippina was ambitious. She was determined that her son become emperor.
Agrippina had been born into the heart of the aristocracy and the ruling family. It was very dangerous to be a member of the imperial family at this stage. There was intrigue on all sides, and people were resorting to poisoning and divorce and banishment, and all kinds of things might happen. So she knew that she would really have to fight for her children and for herself to keep alive and certainly to succeed.
The arrogance and cruelty of Caligula turned the Roman aristocracy against him. Many claimed he was insane. He was reputed to have appointed his own horse as consul. After less than 4 years in power, he became the first Roman emperor to be assassinated. Claudius, Agrippina's uncle, was proclaimed the new Caesar. He recalled his exiled niece to Rome, where she was reunited with her son Lucius and took her place at court.
Lucius would have been brought up surrounded by Agrippina's friends, by very many attendants and slaves and courtiers. He certainly would have been exposed to a lot of flattery. He had tutors, of course. He probably had very little exposure to the outside world.
Historians say that when he was supposed to be learning his literature and his rhetoric, he was actually much more interested in sculpture, in painting, in writing songs, in singing, and he has certain tastes which we feel rather sympathetic to.
When Lucius was 11, the imperial house was once again shaken by scandal. Claudius's wife, Messalina, publicly married her lover and declared him emperor. Claudius crushed the coup and ordered his wife to commit suicide. Distraught and betrayed, he vowed never to marry again. Agrippina seized the opportunity. Using all her charm, she seduced her uncle Claudius. He was persuaded to change his mind and take her as his 4th wife.
She holds her dignity, her modesty, her body, everything cheaper than a throne. Tacitus.
Agrippina is a member of a terrifying dynastic setup where to survive the maneuvers, just the maneuvers within the family, are scary. The moment that Agrippina marries Claudius, that creates a possibility for her to get her son, Lucius Ahenobarbus, converted into the son of Claudius and the future emperor, and that's precisely what she succeeds in doing.
Claudius had 2 young children of his own. Britannicus, a son, named after Claudius's earlier conquest of Britain, and a daughter, Octavia. Agrippina soon arranged the betrothal of the 9-year-old Octavia to her son Lucius, tying the families closer together. Then she persuaded Claudius to adopt Lucius as his own son, giving him the name Nero Claudius Caesar. At the age of 13, Nero made his first speech to the Senate. This was written by his tutor, Seneca, the foremost scholar in Rome.
Seneca is one of the most important figures in Roman literature, and he had an unenviable position in being the tutor to a potential prince. But he tried very hard to bring him up with ideas about philosophy and about clemency and about just rule.
Although Nero had been adopted by Claudius, he had not been designated his heir. As Britannicus grew older, Agrippina feared that Claudius would mark out his own son as his successor. Agrippina decided to act. During a banquet on the 12th of October, AD 54, Claudius collapsed and went into a coma. Later that night, he died. Rumors soon spread that Agrippina had poisoned her husband, the emperor.
Agrippina sent for a famous dealer in poisons, a woman named Lucasta, and preparing with her aid a poison whose effect was certain, she applied it to a mushroom, Cassius Dio.
What makes it so suspicious is the timing of it. Britannicus is still hasn't come of age, but if they leave it any longer, Britannicus will come of age. And they have to strike now, while Nero is at the minimum age to be a plausible emperor.
At noon the following day, Nero appeared outside the palace, accompanied by his mother. The 16-year-old prince was hailed Emperor of Rome.
If the frailty of my youth goes in any respect astray, guide me yet more zealously. Nero.
Nero addressed the Senate. He grandly promised to uphold aristocratic traditions and treat the senators' views with respect. But Nero soon discovered that his ambitious mother planned to share his power.
Agrippina took the view that as she was largely responsible for getting him on the throne, that he should accept her virtually as a joint ruler. And the first coins of the reign show the two heads looking at each other, and they're obviously meant to be equivalent. I think Nero did not accept this, and his advisors certainly did not accept this. So it was a battle of wills from the very beginning.
To counter his mother's influence, the young emperor surrounded himself with trusted advisors. Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, and Seneca, his former tutor. The philosopher Seneca was in a position of enormous influence. His young charge now ruled the civilized world. Seneca encouraged Nero to believe in clemency, justice, and the sanctity of human life.
He was rather tempted by the picture that Seneca presented of the sort of popularity you could get by being a good, generous ruler. And he rather liked exercising clemency and being judicious about criticism and that kind of thing. So I think one can see that there were promising elements in the way he behaved.
With the young Nero guided by his expert advisors, Rome and the Empire enjoyed a period of strength, efficient administration, and economic stability.
You've got an institutional structure. You've got tax collectors, you've got soldiers, and you've got responsible administrative officials. And the governmental system works really quite well if there is no external crisis.
We have very hostile views of Nero in our written sources. But as far as we know, when he was young, he was intelligent, he was talented. There's no reason to suppose that he was always as he became later.
Rome's provinces were stable and profitable. Seneca encouraged Nero to look even further afield, prompting him to send explorers north and south. One group went to the Baltic and to the edges of Scandinavia and came back laden with precious amber.
Nero could have turned out to be very different on the basis of what Seneca had tried to instruct him in. But I think there was always a tension in the young Nero between what could be described as duty, the way to behave, and the path that he wanted to pursue for himself, because there was always, I think, in Nero this desire to pursue what he thought he was good at, which was, of course, the artistic side of his life.
Much to his mother's disgust, Nero began to explore his growing love of the theater. In private, he consorted with actors, dancers, and musicians. It was not long before he had taken up these arts himself.
Little by little he began to study and practice and conscientiously undertook all the usual exercises for strengthening and developing the voice. He would lie on his back with a slab of lead on his chest, use enemas to keep down his weight, and refrain from eating apples and every other food considered damaging to the vocal cords. Suetonius.
The theatrical profession was wholly unsuitable for an aristocrat, unthinkable for the emperor. Tiring of Agrippina's criticisms, Nero used his advisors to keep his mother at bay.
Some think that he simply left the government in the hands of his advisors and carried on with his aesthetic activities. The best historian we have thinks it wasn't as simple as that, and thinks that he was actually ruling under guidance and was accepting instructions because the advisors he had, Seneca and Burrus, protected him from his mother, and therefore he was prepared to listen to them. And that, I think, is probably closer to the truth.
He was interested in experiencing things to the full. He wanted to be a great artist, for example. And I suppose fairly soon he began to realize that he really could do anything he liked. And he didn't have to follow the advice of his tutors. And then he could just simply follow his own instincts. And that's what he did.
Gradually, Nero's vices gained the upper hand. Suetonius.
Surrounded by luxury and flattery, Nero grew less and less interested in governing the empire.
The real problem for him was that, as a man who had now passed into his early 20s, he was coming to the view that he wished to be master of his own destiny and not be dictated to by other people.
Nero began to explore the possibilities of absolute power.
Whereas at first Nero was comparatively moderate in the revels he conducted and in his drinking and his amours, yet later, as no one reproved him, he came to believe that such conduct was really not bad, and that he could carry it even further. Cassius Dio.
Theoretically, you're omnipotent. Theoretically, you can do everything that you want. Okay, there may be occasional impatiences that people don't carry out your orders. But very soon, it seems to me quite human that you would think, why should I behave properly? I am the head of the world. If I want a woman, I should have her. I want a boy, I should have him. If I want a slave, I want wealth, if I want to abuse my power, who is going to stop me? And what Nero did is he experimented with the limits of autocratic power.
I think he's brought up in rather neurotic circumstances, with a domineering mother and so on. And he hasn't been trained, in a sense, properly for his responsibilities. You have to be a rather intelligent, shrewd person to understand what's demanded of you in that system and to stand up to flatterers who may tell you what you want to hear rather than what you should hear. So I think from that point of view, his character does show up. The problem with a system which requires an exceptionally intelligent ruler.
Later historians who sought to denigrate him found Nero an easy target for their slanders.
His feasts now lasted from noon till midnight. Whenever he floated down the Tiber to Ostia, he had a row of temporary brothels erected along the shore, where married women pretending to be innkeepers solicited him to come ashore. Nero practiced every kind of obscenity, and after defiling almost every part of his body, finally invented a novel game. He was released from a cage, dressed in the skins of wild animals, and attacked the private parts of men and women who stood bound to stakes. After working up sufficient excitement by this means, he was dispatched, shall we say, by his servant, Suetonius.
It was said that Nero stalked the streets of Rome at night in disguise with a gang of friends. And the accusations against him became increasingly serious.
As soon as night fell, he would snatch a cap or a wig and make a round of the taverns, or prowl the streets in search of mischief. And not always innocent mischief either, because one of his games was to attack men on their way home from dinner, stab them if they offered resistance, and then drop their bodies in the sewer. Suetonius.
You get these pictures of Nero going around and quite unnecessarily just beating people up in the streets at random. Interestingly, we hear from other sources that that was almost an acknowledged sport at the time. It's something that young bloods enjoyed doing in the evening.
I think absolute power did have a corrupting effect on Nero, just as it had on Caligula. It's almost bound to have a corrupting effect on anyone, but on people who get it too young, it's extremely difficult to understand what constraints you have to impose on yourself.
Aware that she could no longer control her son, Agrippina chose to develop her relationship with her stepson, Britannicus. Nero saw this as a threat to his rule. His response was swift and brutal. At a palace dinner, Britannicus suddenly collapsed in convulsions and died. Nero, unperturbed, claimed his stepbrother had suffered an epileptic fit. As the guests continued to dine, Britannicus's body was already being burnt.
Well, Nero must have realized that getting away with the murder of Britannicus, as he did, weakened the authority of his mentors. I think he must have realized that. And they went along with the concealment of the murder and were probably among the people who accepted presents and so on that he gave afterwards.
Agrippina tried desperately to regain influence over her son, but in vain. Nero now turned on her.
The over-watchful, over-critical eye that Agrippina kept on whatever Nero said or did proved more than he could stand. He refused to have her living with him and expelled her from his palace, after which he did everything possible to annoy her, sending people to pester her, disturbing her with jeers and catcalls. In the end, her threats and violent behavior terrified him into deciding that she must die. Suetonius.
Nero invited Agrippina to dine with him at his villa near the Bay of Naples. That evening, he presented her with a gift, a boat for her return journey. But the boat had been constructed to collapse and drown her. The plan failed. Nero was horrified to learn that she had managed to swim to safety. All subtlety was now abandoned. He sent his naval officers to her villa to murder her.
The murderers closed around her bed. First, the captain hit her on the head with a truncheon. Then, as the lieutenant was drawing his sword to finish her off, she cried out, "Strike here," pointing to her womb. Blow after blow fell, and she died. Tacitus.
Nero announced that Agrippina had been plotting his assassination and proclaimed a public thanksgiving for the emperor's deliverance from this danger.
The Romans are having to live a lie at this point. They're having to pretend that their ruler is a good guy and watch him bodge the job of murdering his own mother. In the end, they don't care what he thinks of his mother or not, but it's absolutely humiliating to be subjected to this spectacle of what in any rules of society must be fundamentally wrong. Matricide, being practiced by an emperor who is pretending to be above suspicion. And this it most gravely damages his credibility.
The first shadows of tyranny were cast over Rome.
I, Nero Caesar, win this contest.
Freed from the influence of his mother and the firm grip of his advisors, Nero was now able to devote his time and energy to his real ambition: to be Rome's greatest performer. He began to indulge his passion for chariot racing. Charioteers were trained slaves, and Nero's extraordinary antics horrified the aristocracy. But the people flocked to see their emperor race.
To see the emperor is an excitement already. To see him come out of the imperial box and put on a show, that's something new, that's really fun. I think the audiences must have gone berserk. He's desperate for applause because he's got himself in a fix. If you murder your brother and your mother and so on, you're going to have to work very hard to get applause. If you aren't a great successful general, what is it you've done that's earned the applause of the crowds? And you then have to find ways of generating that artificially. And chucking money at the games is a classic desperate remedy. Nero gives them games and becomes the act himself.
Nero encouraged games that relied on ingenious spectacle. Wild beast hunts, camel racing, elephant performance, and mock sea battles in the flooded arena all delighted the crowds. In AD 60, Nero inaugurated a new series of games, the Neronia, loosely modeled on the Olympic Games. Contestants competed in gymnastics and chariot racing, poetry, music, oratory, and athletics. The games were not only designed to boost his popularity. Nero saw himself as a patron of high culture and the arts.
I think he saw in government an opportunity to do something that he wanted to do, which was to change some of these tastes, to get people to see that aesthetic activities could be respectable and worthwhile. And so he tried to introduce the governing class to Greek athletics. He tried to get them to perform and to train them in music schools and this kind of thing. So I think he saw that as part of his function of emperor.
By AD 62, at the age of 24, Nero finally dispensed with the advisors of his youth. Burrus died, possibly poisoned, and Seneca was forced into retirement.
He came to despise good advice, since he was always hearing from his associates, "Do you not know you are Caesar, and that you have authority over them rather than they over you?" Cassius Dio.
In all emperor-run systems, there's a climate of fear. Everybody has done something wrong, or everyone can be accused of doing something wrong. Everyone can be accused of having slagged off the emperor behind his back. It's a bitchy, secret, competitive system in which fear, it's pervasive. Hypocrisy is pervasive. The very word courtoisie, courtesy, is a word invented to describe how people behave in courts. They keep their emotions hidden from other people.
Nero wanted to marry his pregnant lover, Poppaea, and rid himself of the bride of his youth, Octavia. She had not produced Nero an heir. Octavia was popular with the masses as the virtuous daughter of the divine Claudius. Nero's attempt to blacken her name as an adulteress led to public disturbances. Her maid is said to have spat in the face of an interrogator and cried, "The private parts of my mistress are cleaner than your mouth." Undaunted, Nero banished Octavia to an island. There, out of the public eye, he had her murdered. "12 days later, he married Poppaea.
Poppaea had every asset except goodness. She seemed respectable, but her life was depraved. She would half veil her face to stimulate curiosity. To her, married men or bachelors were all the same. Tacitus.
Poppaea was beautiful and vain. She kept a herd of 500 donkeys so as to bathe in their milk. In January AD 63, to Nero's delight, she gave birth to a daughter, Claudia. but by March, the infant had died. With no heir and fearful of rivals, Nero was to execute all his relatives in the imperial family. The future of the dynasty would depend on him alone.
Good. Now at last I can begin to live like a human being. Nero.
On July the 18th, AD 64, in the 10th year of his reign, Nero was residing at his seaside villa south of Rome. There he received news that his capital was ablaze.
Now started the most terrible and destructive fire, breaking out in shops selling inflammable goods, and fanned by the wind, the conflagration instantly grew. Tacitus.
There was shouting and wailing without end of children, women, men, and the aged all together, so that no one could see anything or understand what was being said by reason of the smoke and the shouting. Meanwhile, many who were carrying their goods, and many too who were stealing the property of others, kept running into one another and falling over their burdens. Many were suffocated, many were trampled underfoot. Cassius died.
Nero hurried back to Rome to organize firefighting and relief measures.
Nero constructed emergency accommodation for the many destitute. Food was brought from Ostia and neighboring towns, and the price of corn was cut. Yet these measures, for all their popular character, earned no gratitude. Tacitus.
3/4 of the city had been burnt. But amid the destruction, Nero saw a great opportunity. The center of Rome had become an empty stage on which he could build and design a new city. It was rumored he would call it Neropolis.
The Great Fire of July 64 cleared an enormous site in the center of Rome and enabled him to replan the city. It was going to have wide boulevards, it was going to have fire-resistant stone. It was quite a sensible plan. It was going to be extended, and in the center there would be this great palace with parks, real green spaces in the center of Rome.
Nero spared no expense on an extraordinary new palace called the Golden House.
The entrance hall was large enough to contain a huge statue of himself, 120 feet high, and the pillared arcade ran for a whole mile. An enormous pool, like a sea, was surrounded by buildings made to resemble cities, and by a landscape garden consisting of ploughed fields, vineyards, pastures, and woodlands, where every variety of domestic and wild animal roamed about. Parts of the house were overlaid with gold and studded with precious stones and mother-of-pearl. All the dining rooms had ceilings of fretted ivory, the panels of which could slide back and let a rain of flowers or of perfume from hidden sprinklers shower upon his guests. The main dining room was circular, and its roof revolved by day and night in time with the sky. When the palace had been decorated throughout in this lavish style, Nero condescended to remark, "Good. Now I can at last begin to live like a human being." Suetonius.
This extravagance was shocking. Wild rumors even spread that Nero had started the Great Fire to create a site for his new palace.
Of course the Great Fire was an accident. Nobody, however insane, attempts to burn their own city down. But as far as his popular image was concerned, it was a decisive negative turning point.
Nero badly needed a scapegoat on whom to blame the Great Fire. He settled on an obscure religious sect that had been steadily growing since the death of its founder 3 decades earlier in Judea. They were called the Christians.
Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Vast numbers were convicted, and derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses and were burned to serve as lamps by night. Tacitus.
Although the Christians were unpopular, many Romans felt sympathy for their terrible fate. The reign of a once promising youth had sunk into cruelty and chaos.
A violent power no ruler wields for long. Seneca.
Nero returned to his first love, the theatre. He wanted to perform songs and stage plays, but now he sought to perform in public. The Roman elite were horrified.
How could one endure even to hear about, let alone behold, a Roman, a senator, a Caesar, an emperor, named on the program among the contestants, training his voice, practicing various songs, wearing long hair? In putting on the mask of an actor, he threw off the dignity of his sovereignty. Cassius Dio.
All these activities were absolutely horrendous for a member of the upper classes and for the emperor to indulge in. It's as though the Queen or the President of the US decided to do mud wrestling. It's vulgar, it's horrendous. Everybody would object.
No one was allowed to leave the theatre during his recitals, however pressing the reason. We read of women in the audience giving birth, and of men being so bored with listening and applauding that they furtively dropped down from the wall at the rear, since the gates were kept barred, or shammed death and were carried away for burial. Suetonius.
In AD 65, some of Nero's enemies, who could stand his behavior no longer, prepared to strike. But the plot was uncovered. In his rage, Nero executed or forced to commit suicide more than 50 senators and army officers. One officer, asked by Nero why he had abandoned his military oath, replied,
"Because I hated you. I was loyal as any of your soldiers as long as you deserved affection. I began hating you when you murdered your mother and wife and became charioteer, actor, and fire starter." Flavius.
Seneca, Nero's former tutor and advisor, was implicated in the plot and also forced to commit suicide. Even Nero's wife, Poppaea, did not survive this period. One night, furious at being criticized for coming home late from the races, Nero kicked Poppaea so violently that she and her unborn child both died. In a worsening atmosphere of terror, hundreds of aristocrats and courtiers were killed or sent into exile. Spies were everywhere, in brothels, in public lavatories, markets. Fear and suspicion pervaded Rome.
Who's going to say, overtly, let's kill him. Who's going to organize friends in such a way that they can assassinate the emperor? Even to mention it as a possibility to your closest friend risks betrayal and risks your own death.
In the provinces, the legions were still loyal to the name of Caesar. As long as they supported him, Nero's rule was secure. Nero felt confident enough to embark on a grand artistic tour of Greece. But here, Nero struck at the heart of the military high command. Rome's most respected general, Corbulo, was accused of plotting against him. He was summoned to Greece and forced to commit suicide.
The death of Corbulo was a sign, I think, to everybody that you were not safe if you were successful and if you were well born. He also put to death the governors of Germany. I think it caused enormous insecurity in the high command and must definitely have contributed to any commander who was hesitating as to whether to rebel.
The commanders of the armies in the provinces are, of course, dependent on the emperor for their own careers. And they are vulnerable to the ambitions, perhaps, of other commanders in other provinces. So they're going to be very reluctant to raise rebellion. When they do, it's because they've really had enough.
Some in Rome's military high command now began plotting to strike. Meanwhile, Nero continued to show off his talents as charioteer, singer, and actor. He was showered with prizes and awards. At the Olympic Games, he even won the 10-horse chariot race, despite falling from his chariot and failing to finish. Nero returned to Rome in a blaze of pomp and lavish ceremony. Proudly, he displayed his 1,808 victory garlands. But it was an empty spectacle. Finally, rebellion broke out. First in Gaul, then in Spain. Some legions renounced Nero and proclaimed the commander, Galba, as emperor. All was not lost, for the powerful armies on the Rhine remained loyal. But their Caesar, Nero, panicked.
I think Nero could have turned the situation round. The stories are that he'd lost contact with reality by that time. And I think to some extent this must be true, but in fact the general in Germany was loyal to him. And had he taken some kind of decisive action, I think the troops in northern Italy also were loyal to him. But he created a vacuum by panicking and allowed the disloyal prefect of the guard to turn them against him. The Senate follows suit, and then the armies did.
After 14 years as emperor, Nero fled Rome in disguise. On the 9th of June, AD 68, hiding in a villa in the Roman suburbs, Nero heard that the Senate had declared him a public enemy. Having lost all hope, he ordered his servant to stab him. He lacked the courage to kill himself. The 30-year-old emperor's dying words were, "What an artist I die."
I find Nero extremely difficult to understand. We can't really get at Nero. We have such conflicting and such violent opinions from contemporary writers. Sometimes it's hard to believe that he was really sane. I think he was taken in by his own acting. He saw himself as playing a role, and that role was something in a Greek tragedy.
He's a great slob in many ways, this guy who got to imperial power for all the wrong reasons and then abused it once he was there. And on the face of it, one shouldn't have a good word to say for him. But the truth is, he had style. He really did. He had artistic style. And his reputation, historically, for future generations, including the present, remains of someone who was really colourful, had something to say for himself. And in that sense, I think Nero remains a perversely attractive character while being pretty abominable.
He was too young, too inexperienced, too unintelligent, and too lacking in self-discipline. And it was a difficult system to run, even for a very intelligent and experienced man. And I think one has to say that it was a disaster in the end, and that no amount of beautiful artworks can compensate for the deaths of so many people.
After a century of peace, Rome once again descended into what Romans feared most: civil war.
The whole system of government nearly collapsed under Nero. The system is set up to avoid civil war, and it disintegrates into civil war. It's very interesting that during Nero's reign, people were praising him as saying, "You are the guy who stands between us and civil war." They knew the alternative. They could see the dangers, and he failed them. He didn't keep it away.
Nero was the last descendant of Caesar and Augustus. With him fell the dynasty. But the name Caesar lived on. A new breed of soldier emperors would emerge from the provinces to seize the vacant crown.